The bank denied my mortgage because my own parents secretly stole my identity for 14 years to bail out my golden child brother. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 33 years old, and 3 months ago I found out my parents had been stealing my identity since I was 19. Not stealing like some stranger in a data breach, stealing like sitting across from me at Thanksgiving dinner, passing me the mashed potatoes, asking about my job, while somewhere in a filing cabinet in Dayton, Ohio, there were 4 credit cards and 2 personal loans with my name and my social security number on them that I never signed for. Well, that I never knowingly signed for. I want to tell you this whole thing from the beginning because if I just tell you the ending, you won't understand why I did what I did. And I need you to understand because for months I didn't understand it myself. I kept asking, how does a person's own mother do this? How does a father look his daughter in the eye for 14 years and let her think she's just bad with money? Just careless, just irresponsible, when the whole time he knew exactly why her credit score looked like a crime scene. So let's start there. Let's start with the loan officer. It was February, and I was sitting in a beige little office at a credit union off Wilmington Pike next to my fiancé, Adam, and we were finally doing it. We were buying our first house, a little 3-bedroom ranch with a crooked mailbox and a giant maple tree in the backyard, and I had already picked out where the couch was going to go. I had a stable job. I was a project coordinator at a logistics company. I'd been saving for 4 years. I did everything right. And the loan officer, a tired-looking woman named Carol, pulled up my credit report, and her face did this thing, this little flicker. And she turned the monitor toward me and said, "Emily, I need to ask you about some of these accounts." I looked at the screen and I did not recognize a single thing on it. There was a Capital One card opened when I was 19, maxed out at $11,000, defaulted. There was a personal loan from a company I'd never heard of for $18,000, also defaulted, sent to collections 2 years ago. There was a Best Buy card, a Kohl's card, both opened when I would have been in college, both delinquent. My credit score wasn't bad. It was catastrophic. 512. I remember laughing. Actually laughing, this short, ugly, disbelieving laugh and saying, "That's not possible. I've never even had a Capital One card." And Carol looked at me with this expression that I would come to know very well over the following weeks, this careful, pitying expression that people get when they've seen this particular kind of disaster before and they know exactly what's coming next, even though the person sitting in front of them doesn't. She said, "Sometimes this happens with family members. Do you have anyone who might have had access to your information when you were younger? A parent, maybe, who could have opened something using your social security number?" And I said no. I said no immediately, defensively, the way you do when somebody suggests something so absurd, it almost offends you. My parents, who raised me in a decent house on a decent street, who went to every single one of my volleyball games, who cried actual tears at my college graduation. My parents did not steal from me. That wasn't a sentence that existed in my world. I left that credit union with no mortgage pre-approval and a folder full of printouts. And I sat in the parking lot with Adam for 20 minutes before either of us could speak. He was the one who finally broke the silence. And I remember exactly what he said, because it turned out to be more accurate than either of us knew at the time. He said, "Em, I've known you for 6 years. I've watched you pay your credit card off in full every single month like it's a religious ritual. I've watched you make a spreadsheet for our grocery budget. There is no version of you that racked up 30 grand in debt and forgot about it. Something is wrong here, and it's not you." I remember being grateful for that in the moment, and also a little embarrassed, because some old, worn-down part of me had already started doing what I'd always done with anything that went wrong in my life, which was assume it was my fault first and ask questions later. That's its own kind of training, by the way. 14 years of being the responsible one doesn't just mean you handle things well, it means that when something breaks, your first instinct is to check your own hands for the blood before you even think to look anywhere else. Adam wanted to call my parents right then, from the parking lot, and I told him no, not yet. I said I needed to see the documents first. I needed to understand what I was looking at before I brought it into a room with the 2 people who had raised me. I think, if I'm honest, some part of me was still protecting them, even then, even with the evidence sitting in a folder on my lap. That's the last time I remember feeling that particular kind of protectiveness toward my parents. It didn't survive the week. Here's the first thing you need to understand about my family, if you're going to understand any of the rest of this. There were 3 kids. Me, the oldest, my brother Kyle, 4 years younger, and my sister Megan, 6 years younger than me. And from as far back as I can remember, there was a kind of unspoken math in our house, an equation nobody ever said out loud, but that all 3 of us understood by instinct before we were even old enough to spell the word favoritism. I was the responsible one. I got good grades. I babysat for extra money. I never got in trouble. I did my chores without being asked twice. And Kyle was the golden one. Kyle was charming. Kyle was funny at dinner parties. Kyle could talk his way out of anything. And when Kyle screwed up, which was often, the screwing up was always framed as a phase. A rough patch. Boys will be boys, he's finding himself. When I screwed up, even in the smallest ways, it became a conversation with a capital C, a referendum on my character. I used to think that was just personality stuff, just how families sort people into roles. I did not know, sitting in that parking lot at 33 years old, that it had a price tag, that it had an actual dollar amount, that it had been quietly bleeding out of my future for 14 years. That night I couldn't sleep, so I did what anyone in my position would do. I started pulling every scrap of paper I could find, my full credit report, all 3 bureaus, and that's when I saw the dates. The Capital One card was opened the month after my 19th birthday. I remembered that month, weirdly specifically, because it was right after I'd come home from my first semester at Sinclair Community College, and my dad had sat me down at the kitchen table with a stack of papers and said we needed to do some financial planning paperwork for my college fund, that there were forms that needed my signature because of some tax thing, and I remember him walking me through it fast, flipping pages saying, sign here, here, and here, and me signing because I was 19 and he was my dad, and why would I question it? I sat there at my kitchen table at 1 a.m, and I felt something crack open in my chest, cold and slow like ice spreading across a lake. I kept scrolling anyway because I already knew, somewhere underneath the part of me still trying to argue myself out of it, that I wasn't going to sleep until I'd seen everything. There was a personal loan opened when I was 22, the same spring I remembered my mother asking me to come by the house to sign off on some paperwork for the home equity line, which at the time I hadn't questioned at all because why would a 22-year-old question her own parents asking for a signature in their own kitchen? There was a Kohl's card opened when I was 24 that I had genuinely never heard of in my life. No memory of signing anything. No memory of a conversation. Nothing. Which meant that one wasn't even a manipulated signature. That one was just forged outright. My name written in handwriting that, when I finally got a copy of the original application months later, was close to mine, but not mine. Close enough to fool an automated system, but not close enough to fool me, once I really looked. I called Adam into the kitchen around 1:30 in the morning and showed him the Kohl's application, side by side with an old checkbook signature of mine from around that same year. And he went very quiet for a long moment. And then he said, "Emily, that's not your signature." And I said, "I know." And neither of us said anything else for a while because there wasn't really anything left to say. We both already knew whose handwriting it probably was. My mother had spent 30 years signing my school permission slips, my report cards, every form a kid needs signed before she's old enough to sign for herself. She knew my signature better than I did. The next morning, I called my mother. I didn't call to accuse her. I want to be honest about that because it matters. I called because some small, stupid, hopeful part of me still thought there was an explanation. Identity theft happens to everyone, right? Maybe someone stole my information from a school database. Maybe it was random. I wanted her to help me be angry at a stranger, not at her. My mother's name is Diane. She's got this voice, warm and a little raspy from decades of Marlboro Lights she swears she quit. And when I told her what I'd found, there was a pause on the other end of the line that lasted just a beat too long. Just long enough that some animal part of my brain, the part that had apparently been quietly cataloging small inconsistencies for 14 years without telling me, went cold and still. "Oh, honey," she said, "let's not do this over the phone. Come by Sunday, we'll figure it out as a family. Come by Sunday. We'll figure it out as a family." I want you to sit with that phrase for a second because it's going to come back around later, and by the time it does, you're going to hate it as much as I do. I went by Sunday. My parents live in the same house I grew up in, a brick colonial on a quiet street in Kettering, and walking up that driveway felt different than it ever had before, like the house itself was in on something. My dad, Robert, was in the kitchen when I came in, and he didn't look up from the coffee he was making, which was its own kind of answer. My dad is not a subtle man. He's an accountant. Was an accountant for 30 years before he retired. Precise, orderly, the kind of man who alphabetizes his spice rack. When he's hiding something, his shoulders go up around his ears like he's bracing for weather. His shoulders were up around his ears. We sat down at that same kitchen table where he'd once told me to sign here, here, and here, and I laid out the printouts. All of them. The cards, the loans, the dates, the amounts. $31,000 in debt, opened across 5 years. All under my name, all defaulted, all sitting on my credit report like a scar. My mother reached for my hand first, which I want you to notice because it was a tactic before it was ever comfort. She reached for my hand before she'd said a single word of explanation, like she was trying to install the forgiveness before the crime had even been named. We were always going to pay it back, she said. Emily, you have to believe that. We never meant for it to get this far. And I said, get what this far? What is this? And that's when my father finally spoke. And I remember his exact words because I have replayed them roughly 4,000 times since. He said, it was for your brother. Just like that. Flat. Like he was reading off a grocery list. It was for your brother. Kyle, it turned out, had been a financial disaster since roughly the age of 22. Not the kind of disaster you recover from with one hard lesson. The kind that repeats. He dropped out of Wright State after 2 years and decided he was going to be an entrepreneur. And over the following decade, he had started and destroyed no fewer than 4 businesses. A car detailing service that failed because he never invoiced anyone. A t-shirt company that failed because he spent the startup capital on a truck. A consulting business that, as far as I can tell to this day, never had a single client. And most recently, some cryptocurrency trading scheme he'd gotten into with a guy he met at a bar, which had swallowed money the way a drain swallows water, fast and total and with a sound like laughter. Every single time Kyle failed, my parents caught him. That was the family religion. Kyle falls, the net appears. And somewhere around when I was 19, the net had run out of their own money, so they'd started using mine. You weren't using your credit, my mother said, and I want you to hear how she said it. Like it was a kindness she'd done me. Like unused credit was some kind of waste that needed to be repurposed. Like a spare bedroom sitting empty. You were young. You weren't buying a house yet. You didn't need it. And we were always going to fix it before it mattered. It mattered yesterday, I said. In a credit union office, in front of my fiancé. It mattered so much that I don't have a house right now. My father actually had the nerve to look wounded by that. Wounded like I was the one being unreasonable. Like I was making a scene over spilled milk instead of $31,000 of fraud with my name signed to it in ink that wasn't even always mine. Because some of those signatures I'd find out later weren't signed by me at all. They were forged. I asked how many times. How many times had they done this? And my mother's answer was the moment everything in me finally completely went cold. We don't remember exactly, she said. A few times over the years. It wasn't like we sat down and planned it out, Emily. It just happened when he needed it. A few times over the years. It just happened. If you've never had the specific experience of realizing that your own family has been quietly using you as a financial organ donor for a decade and a half, I genuinely hope you never do, because there's no way to prepare for it. It doesn't hit you all at once. It hits you in waves, over days, weeks. That first Sunday, I mostly just sat there in a kind of stunned numbness, nodding along to their explanations like I was agreeing with them, because my brain hadn't caught up to my body yet. It would take me another 2 weeks to feel the actual rage. And by the time the rage came, it came with company. It came with every memory of my childhood rearranging itself into a different shape. I remembered being 17 and asking my dad why Kyle got a car for his 16th birthday and I didn't. And my dad telling me that Kyle needed more support navigating the world. Like I was some kind of naturally gifted survivalist, and my brother was a baby bird. I remembered being 23 and struggling to make rent on my first apartment. Actually struggling, eating ramen for 2 weeks straight and never once asking my parents for help because I'd been raised to believe I was the strong one, the one who didn't need it, while the whole time they were quietly bleeding my own credit dry to prop up my brother's failing t-shirt company. I remembered 100 small comments over the years about how I was so responsible and so independent, and I finally understood with a kind of nausea that actually made me physically sick one night that those weren't compliments. They were assessments. I was being rated on my usefulness as a resource, and I had scored very, very high. I want to pause here and ask you something because I've thought about this a lot since. Have you ever found out that a compliment you'd been collecting your whole life, holding on to like a little trophy, was actually just someone describing how convenient you were to exploit? Because that's what responsible meant in my house. It didn't mean they trusted me more. It meant I was safer to steal from because I wouldn't make a scene. Well, I made a scene. The next few weeks were a blur of phone calls to credit bureaus, to the FTC, to a lawyer, and every single conversation surfaced a new detail that made the last one look small by comparison. It wasn't just 4 accounts, it was 7 once I dug into everything, including one my mother had apparently forgotten to mention entirely. A store card at a furniture outlet opened when I was 26 that they'd used to furnish an entire home office for Kyle's crypto venture. A leather chair, a standing desk, a 65-inch monitor. All on my credit, all defaulted, all repossessed eventually, except the desk, which, as far as I know, Kyle still has, still sits in his apartment right now while I write this. And it kept going. That was the part nobody warns you about, how discovering one betrayal doesn't close the book. It just teaches you to keep reading, because there's always another page. 2 weeks after the furniture store card surfaced, my lawyer's paralegal called me with something she said I needed to see in person. And when I sat down across from her, she slid over a printout of a personal line of credit I hadn't caught in my first pass, opened the year I turned 30, right around the time I'd told my parents proudly at a Sunday dinner that I'd finally paid off my student loans in full. I remember that dinner. My mother had made a small cake. She'd hugged me and said she was so proud of how hard I'd worked. 6 weeks after that dinner, according to the documents, she had opened a $9,000 line of credit in my name to cover a down payment on a truck for Kyle's t-shirt business. I sat in that lawyer's office and did the math in my head, the actual timeline of it, and understood for the first time just how deliberate this had been. It wasn't a single moment of panic, a one-time bad decision made under pressure that had spiraled out of control. It was a pattern. It was a system. Every single time I hit a milestone, paid something off, built something up, stabilized something in my own life, there had been, within weeks, a corresponding withdrawal from an account I didn't know I had, like clockwork. Like they were watching my credit recover just so they'd know when there was room to take from it again. I confronted Kyle directly on a Tuesday night at his apartment in Beaver Creek because I needed to hear it from him. I needed to know if he'd known. He knew. Of course he knew. He'd known the whole time. He answered the door in sweatpants, looking mildly annoyed to see me, like I was interrupting something, and when I told him why I was there, his face did this thing that I can only describe as a flinch that immediately reorganized itself into defensiveness. The fastest emotional costume change I have ever witnessed in a human being. Okay, first of all, he said, actually holding up a finger. I never asked them to do that. That was their decision. That's on them, not me. I said, you knew. You used a furniture credit line with my name on it to buy yourself a monitor. I didn't know whose name was on it, he said, which was a lie so obvious and so lazy that I actually respected it for its economy. It didn't even try to be believable. Mom and Dad handled all the money stuff for the business. I wasn't checking whose account it was. I asked him if he was going to help pay any of it back. And here's where my brother said something that I think about more than almost anything else in this entire nightmare, because it tells you everything about the architecture of my family in a single sentence. He said, I'm barely keeping my head above water right now. You have a good job. Can't you just handle it? You've always been better with this stuff than me. You've always been better with this stuff than me. As if financial responsibility were a talent, like perfect pitch, that some people simply have and others don't, and it would be cruel to expect a person without the gift to develop it. As if the fact that I could manage money meant I existed to manage his. As if my competence were not a personal trait, but a public utility that the family was entitled to draw from whenever his ran dry. I left his apartment without saying another word because if I'd stayed another 30 seconds, I don't know what would have come out of my mouth, and I didn't trust myself with it yet. Now you'd think, given all of this, that my sister Megan would have been horrified. You'd think that watching her older sister get financially gutted for 14 years to bankroll their brother's mediocrity would have made her furious on my behalf. It did not. Megan is 27, and Megan has always occupied this strange third position in our family, not the golden child, not the responsible one, but something like the diplomat, the one who smooths things over, and I used to think that was a kind and stabilizing quality in her. I no longer think that. I think Megan learned the same way Kyle learned that keeping my parents comfortable was the safest and most rewarded position in the house, and so when I called her that week, hoping for an ally, what I got instead was a masterclass in family gaslighting, delivered in a soft, reasonable voice. I just think, she said, and I want you to notice how many sentences from my family started with, I just think, as though every devastating thing they were about to say required a disclaimer of moderation first. I just think you're not really seeing the whole picture. Mom and Dad have been under so much stress with Kyle for years. This wasn't them trying to hurt you. And honestly, going to the police over this, or getting lawyers involved, that feels really extreme for something that's a family issue. I said, it's fraud, Megan. It's identity theft. There's a legal term for what they did, and it's not a family issue. I know it sounds bad when you put it that way, she said, and I remember exactly where I was standing when she said this, in my kitchen, staring at a crack in the tile that I'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. But you're going to tear this whole family apart over money that they were always planning to pay back eventually. Is that really worth it? Mom's health isn't great. This is going to destroy her. There it was. The move I now think of as the real family specialty, more reliable than any of the others. It's not an argument, it's a redirection. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about $31,000 of fraud committed against me. It was about my mother's blood pressure. It was about whether I was willing to be the kind of daughter who would destroy a sick woman over something as petty as, apparently, having her steal from me for a decade and a half. I hung up on my sister. First time in my life I'd ever done that to her. For about 10 days after that, there was a kind of uneasy silence. My mother texted a few times, short messages that were technically apologies, but somehow managed to contain no actual acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Things like, I hope you know how much we love you, and this has been such a hard time for the whole family. And my personal favorite, we just want to move forward as a family. Move forward. As if the fraud were a pothole we'd all agreed to drive around together, rather than a crime one half of the family had committed against the other. I didn't respond to most of them. I was busy. I'd hired a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Rachel who specialized in identity theft cases, and she was the first person in this entire process who looked at my file and said, out loud, the sentence I had apparently been needing to hear from an outside adult for 6 weeks. Emily, this is criminal. What was done to you has a name, and it's a felony in the state of Ohio. I want to tell you about the day everything blew up completely, because it's the day I stopped being the person who tries to hold a family together and became the person who was willing to watch it burn. It was a Sunday, of course. My mother had asked me to come over one more time, said she wanted to clear the air before things went any further, and against my lawyer's advice, honestly, I went, because some stubborn part of me still wanted one real conversation before I pulled the trigger on anything legal. I wanted, I think, for someone in that house to simply say the sentence, I did this to you and I am sorry, without a qualifier attached to it. I didn't get that sentence. I got something much worse. I walked in and Kyle was there, and Megan was there. My mother had assembled the whole cast, apparently for what I quickly realized was not going to be an apology. It was going to be an intervention. On me. My father started it, sitting stiffly at the head of the table, and he said, Emily, we've all talked, and we think you're not handling this the right way. Getting a lawyer involved? That's escalating something that could be handled privately, as a family. We're worried about what this is doing to you. This anger isn't like you, it's like key. This anger isn't like me. As if rage at being defrauded by your own parents for 14 years were a personality disorder rather than the single most appropriate emotional response available to a human being in my exact situation. My mother added, we're prepared to set up a payment plan, Emily. We can start paying you back monthly. But bringing in lawyers, that's going to cost everyone. And it's going to hurt this family in ways you can't take back. I said, you mean it's going to hurt you? There's a difference. Kyle predictably chose this moment to insert himself, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed and said, honestly, this whole thing feels like you're using this as an excuse to finally punish everyone for stuff you've been mad about your whole life. Like, we get it. You felt like the less favorite kid growing up. But dragging mom and dad through a legal case isn't therapy, Em. And that was the sentence. That was the exact sentence that took whatever was left of my restraint and burned it down to the studs. I stood up. I remember my hands were shaking, not from fear, from the sheer electric force of finally letting 14 years of swallowed anger reach my mouth at once. I said, you want to talk about using things as an excuse? You used my name, my social security number, my credit, my entire financial future, as an excuse to keep bailing you out every single time you failed at something for 10 years. I am not the one who did the using in this family. I was the one being used, and I only just found out. My mother started crying, which, again, I want you to notice the timing of. Not when she confessed, not when I found out. Exactly when I finally raised my voice back at them for the first time in my life. How can you talk to us like this? She said, after everything we've done for you. And I laughed. I actually laughed standing there in that kitchen, because the sheer audacity of that sentence, after everything we've done for you, arriving approximately 90 seconds after they had finished explaining that everything they'd done for me was secretly stealing $31,000 in my name, was almost funny. Almost. I said, you're right. I should be more grateful. Thank you for the identity theft. Thank you for the felony. Thank you for 14 years of letting me think I was just bad at something I was never even allowed to control. My father's face went red, the way it used to when I was a kid, and had pushed some invisible line I never knew the exact location of. And he said, watch your tone in my house. And I said, this isn't your house, Dad. It's your house that a company technically owns 40% of because you refinanced it twice using accounts under my name to cover the payments when Kyle's second business failed. I checked. I have the documents. I Should I bring those out too, or is this family conversation only allowed to go one direction? The silence after that sentence was the loudest silence I have ever experienced in my life. Nobody had an answer for that one. Because it was true, and they knew I had the paperwork, and for the first time in this entire nightmare, I watched my parents realize that I wasn't a hurt daughter anymore who might still be talked down. I was a woman with a lawyer and a folder of documented crimes, and there was no version of let's move forward as a family that was going to make that folder disappear. I left that house, and I did not go back. Over the following month, my lawyer helped me file police reports for identity theft and fraud, formally, with every document, every date, every dollar amount laid out in black and white. I want to be honest, this part wasn't cinematic. It wasn't a single dramatic moment of handcuffs and sirens. It was a slow, grinding, bureaucratic process, detective interviews, more paperwork, credit bureau disputes that took weeks to resolve, a fraud affidavit for every single account. It was exhausting in a completely different way than the emotional part had been, but it was mine. It was the first thing in this entire situation that I actually controlled. I remember sitting across from a detective named Officer Willis in a small interview room at the Kettering police station, laying out 7 years of forged documents across a table while she took notes, and at one point she looked up at me and asked very gently, the way I think people ask questions when they already suspect the answer is going to be sad, is there any part of you that doesn't want to go through with this, given that it's your parents? And I sat with that question longer than I expected to. I thought about every Sunday dinner, every graduation, every ordinary Tuesday phone call where my mother had asked how my day was, all of it happening while this was quietly running underneath the entire relationship like a current I couldn't see. And I told the detective the truth. I said, I spent 33 years being taught that keeping the peace was my job. Nobody ever once asked whether keeping the peace was working out for me. She didn't say anything else about it after that. She just kept writing. The paperwork alone took most of that month. 7 accounts meant 7 separate fraud affidavits, 7 sets of correspondence with 3 different credit bureaus, 7 phone calls to collection agencies who had, at various points, called me directly demanding payment on debts I hadn't known existed. Debts that I now understood had probably terrified some younger version of me during a few strange phone calls over the years that I'd genuinely forgotten about until this whole thing forced me to remember them. I found an old voicemail on a backed-up phone from when I was 25, a debt collector's voice asking about a Best Buy account, and I remembered, faintly, calling my mother about it back then, confused, and her telling me it was probably a scam call to just ignore it and block the number. I had believed her completely. I had blocked the number. I had gone on with my week. My mother called 11 times in the first week after I filed the reports. I didn't answer any of them. She left voicemails that shifted over the course of those calls from wounded to pleading to, by about the 8th one, something closer to threatening, saying things like, "You're going to regret tearing this family apart over money," and "Your father could go to prison because of this. Is that what you want, Emily?" And I remember listening to that particular voicemail standing in my kitchen with Adam beside me, and instead of the guilt she was clearly trying to summon in me, what I actually felt was something closer to relief. Because finally, someone in my family had said a true sentence out loud. Yes, that was, in fact, exactly what I wanted. Not because I hated my father. Because for 14 years, actions had never had consequences in that house unless they landed on me, and I was done being the only person in my family who understood cause and effect. Kyle texted me once a single message, no punctuation, that said, hope or happy. And I stared at that message for a long time before I finally understood what it actually was. It wasn't an accusation. It was a confession dressed up as an insult. Because underneath hope or happy was the real sentence he could never bring himself to say, which was, I know exactly what I did to you, and I would rather call you the villain than admit it. I didn't respond to that one either. Here's where I need to tell you something that I think a lot of people watching this won't want to hear, because it doesn't have the tidy shape of a happy ending. About 5 months after I filed the police reports, Kyle's crypto scheme, the one my identity had helped fund, collapsed completely, and he lost what little money he had left along with it. Around the same time, my father, who had refinanced that house twice on the back of accounts stolen in my name, found himself unable to make the payments once the fraudulent accounts were finally frozen and closed by the credit bureaus, which meant the emergency credit lines that had been quietly propping up my parents' entire financial existence for years simply vanished overnight. They were, by the end of that year, in genuine, serious trouble, behind on the mortgage. Kyle moved back in with them because he had nowhere else to go. both of my parents in their 60s, and suddenly facing the real possibility of losing the house I grew up in. And my mother called me, not angry this time, just quiet and small, and asking if there was any way I could help, if I could maybe co sign something or lend them some money just to get through this rough patch, just this once, and we could put everything else behind us. I sat with that phone call for a long time before I answered it. Okay? And I said no. I didn't say it cruelly. I didn't yell. I said it the way you say a fact, calm and final. The way my father used to say things to me when I was a kid. And he wanted me to understand that a decision had already been made, and there was no version of the conversation where I got what I wanted. I said, I spent 14 years being the financial safety net for this family without ever agreeing to it, without ever even knowing about it. I am not going to volunteer for the job now that I finally have a choice. She asked me how I could be so cold, how I could let my own parents lose their home. And I told her the truth, which is that I didn't let anything happen to them. They did this. Every choice, every forged signature, every quiet decision to spend my future, instead of confronting their own, they made those choices with two working hands and full knowledge of what they were doing for 14 years, while I made none of them at all. I didn't put them in this position. I simply, for the first time in my entire life, declined to get them out of one. I have not spoken to my parents since that call. I have not spoken to Kyle since the text message. Megan and I still talk occasionally, carefully like two people standing on opposite sides of a crack that's slowly widening in the floor between them, and I don't know yet whether that relationship survives what's coming, because there's still a civil case pending, still restitution to be determined by a court, still a very real chance that my father's going to face actual criminal charges for what he did, and Megan has made it clear she thinks I should drop all of it for the family. I'm not going to drop it. I bought a house eventually, by the way, smaller than the one Adam and I originally wanted because the fraud took over a year to fully untangle even after everything was reported, and our timeline got pushed back and our budget got tighter, but it's ours. It's the first thing with my name on it that I know with total certainty I actually signed for myself. Megan called me once, right around the time the civil case was finally moving toward a settlement conference, and for the first time in this whole ordeal, she didn't open with a defense of our parents. She opened with a question. She asked me if I'd known back when we were kids that anything was happening, and I told her no, not for a second. Not until I was 33 years old, sitting in a beige office being told my credit score was 512. And she went quiet. And then she said something I didn't expect. She said she'd found her own name on an old utility bill years ago that she never remembered opening. Small, only a few $100s. And she just assumed it was a mistake and paid it off herself without ever asking questions. I didn't say anything for a while. I think we were both doing the same math at the same time. The two of us, sitting on opposite ends of a phone call, quietly recalculating our entire childhoods in real time. I don't know if Megan will ever fully choose my side of this. I don't know if she's capable of it, given everything she still has riding on staying close to our parents in a way I no longer do. But that phone call was the first time I felt like she was actually looking at the evidence, instead of just looking away from it. And for now, that's the only bridge I've got left standing, and I'm not in any hurry to build more. I think about that kitchen table a lot. The one where my father once told me to sign here, here, and here. And the one where, years later, I stood up and told my whole family out loud that I would not be signing anything else for them ever again without reading every single word first. So here's what I want to leave you with if you've made it this far. If somebody in your life, especially somebody who's supposed to love you, tells you that questioning what they did to you is tearing the family apart, I need you to hear what that sentence actually means. It doesn't mean you're the one causing the damage. It means they'd rather you stay silent than watch them face what they've done. Being the responsible one in a family is not a compliment if it means you're the only person who's ever expected to absorb the consequences of everyone else's choices. And love that only shows up as an invoice, love that only asks you to give, never wants to receive, was never really love in the first place. It was a business arrangement you never agreed to sign. I didn't destroy my family. They spent 14 years quietly destroying my future one signature at a time. And the only thing I finally did, the only thing, was stop paying for it.